You and me learn to love one another. Now, all around our side is free. People everywhere just wanna be free. I can't understand, it's so simple to me. It is. People everywhere just got to be free.
All right, A-Push Scholars, Mr. Beamer here. Final video, finally, for period 4, 1800 to 1848. We're going to finish up chapter 17, pages 369 and 378, and finish up the slave situation in the South. Some of the key topics are slave life, slave resistance, the rebellions, and the abolitionists. I want to thank our intro song from Young Rascals, August 1968, People Got to Be Free. It refers, of course, to the slaves of the South. All right, first section is life under the lash. And when you see the word lash, think of the whip. And whipping or floggings become, unfortunately, a part of the life of the slave. So anyway, I think it's an important point. Slave life did vary from place to place. Some slave masters were actually rather nice to their slaves, but some slaves were awful towards some slave owners were awful towards their slaves. So it did vary. It did depend. Some plantations were huge, some were very small, so there wasn't a set way the slaves were treated. But overall, though, to generalize, it was very hard work for the slaves, and they definitely had no civil or political rights as a slave. As I mentioned earlier, the most common form of punishment was whippings or floggings, by the lash, and we've seen some awful pictures of slaves being whipped on their back. We're going to read about that as well in one of our discussions. As we mentioned earlier, most of the slaves by the Civil War time were in the Deep South, especially Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, because of the cotton production there. Many slaves were needed for the cotton production. I would highlight this. Most of the slaves were raised, in general, in stable two-parents households. But there were the forced family separations, especially at slave auctions. And actually, the majority of the family separations happened in the Upper South, in Virginia and also in Maryland, because there wasn't quite as many slaves there that were needed, and so a lot of the slaves were sold south to work in the cotton plantations. Continuing, an important part of this section is the African Americans did develop their own culture, especially more on the larger plantations, and there are many slaves there, especially 100 more slaves on some of these huge plantations. I guess a positive of being on a very large plantation is you did have more privacy on these big plantations than on the small farm. So if you're on a farm with only one or two other slaves, a lot of times you were side by side with your master, so you had very little privacy. African influence does occur, especially with religion, and a lot of these slaves do turn to religion, especially Christianity and their African heritage of being in bondage as hope for their future, especially stories of Christianity with Jesus and Moses about deliverance and salvation, that eventually their salvation will come. More issues with slavery, the burdens of bondage. So slavery was very degrading to many of the slaves. Almost all the slaves, I would highlight this, almost all the slaves were illiterate, meaning they could not read. By 1860, right before the Civil War, 95% of all African Americans could not read. And of course, the slave owners wanted that. They did not want their slaves to be able to read, because if you can read, you become educated. And when you become educated, you start to think. And when you start to think, you start to question. And this is what the slave owners did not want to happen, because they wanted their slaves to be dumb. And so they wouldn't try to rebel against them. Interesting. I wonder if that still goes on today. Okay, another point, very important point, highlight this. Slaves did resist the system through a variety of ways. So how did they resist their slave system? Number one, highlight this, the most common way that slaves resisted their masters was by slowing the pace of the work. So they would not work extremely hard on their job. They would just do enough, just barely enough, so then they would not get whipped for their work. Sometimes they would break equipment as well to rebel against their master. Occasionally they would poison their master's food as well. And occasionally there was some runaways as well through the Underground Railroad. There's that word again that I struggle with. We're going to get to this in a later chapter talking about Harriet Tubman and the Underground RR. Okay, what is missing from slave resistance? And it is the rebellions. Very few slave rebellions or uprisings in antebellum America. About some of the slave rebellions, and I need you to know three. especially one in particular. But the three that are probably the most famous antebellum slave rebellions were the Prosser Rebellion, Richmond, Virginia, 1800, Denmark Vesey, 1822 in South Carolina. They were both unsuccessful. But the one that you need to know was the Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia, 1831. Highlight this. In the year Nat Turner unfortunately did murder 60 Virginians. Many of them were women and children. So he was a slave, murdered white women and children, and it was the worst slave rebellion in America. The whites, of course, were paranoid about slave revolts, and punishment often led to death, and rules became more tightened after Nat Turner. Nat Turner was eventually caught, and he was executed for the rebellion. But this slave rebellion scared white Americans in the South especially, and after this one, there really are no other slave rebellions up until the Civil War. And famous ex-slave Booker T. Washington, you're going to need to know his name later in history. He has a quote about whites in ditches, and he basically says that whites could not hold blacks in a ditch without getting down there with them. Okay, so he was criticizing slavery and saying how wrong it is, which of course it was very wrong. So off to the right here we have some North American slave revolts, and you don't have to know all of them. A couple I'll mention. Maybe we've talked about the New York Slave Revolt in colonial America, and also the Stonewall Rebellion. Both were unsuccessful slave revolts. And then we mentioned Gabriel Prosser, 1800, Denmark Vesey, 1822, unsuccessful. And the most famous slave revolt you need to know, Nat Turner's Rebellion, 1831, killed 60 white Americans, white Southerners. Eventually he is executed, and the slave rebellion is unsuccessful. After this one, there are very few slave rebellions in America. Let's talk about early abolitionism. In 1817, I would highlight this group. The American Colonization Society is created, and the purpose of this Colonization Society was to transport blacks back to Africa, and it was rather successful. Some African Americans did go back to Africa, and they created their own country in Western Africa called Liberia. I would highlight this. So this organization transported blacks back to Africa, and it was founded by free African American slave. And the capital of Liberia was Monrovia. It's named after President James Monroe. Okay, I would highlight this. Very important. In the 1830s, abolitionism is really expanded during the Second Great Awakening. Charles Granderson Finney, probably the greatest preacher of the Second Great Awakening, was an abolitionist, and he inspired through his works to try to end the slavery in America. And so this is when it really begins. Ironically, it's about the same time period as Nat Turner's Rebellion, 1831. After this, abolition takes off in the North. All right, so we're going to throw quite a few names at you, so try to keep straight. Okay, Theodore Wilde is one of the early abolitionists. Not a huge name to know, but put in the back of your mind. He was actually expelled from a theological seminary, which trains pastors, for holding an 18-day debate on slavery. Okay, and he wrote a pamphlet called America, Slavery as It Is. And so he kind of rocked the boat, and he questioned, why do we have slavery? So he's one of the early abolitionists, Theodore Wilde. Also, we'll get to this a lot later in a later chapter, but Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852. Perhaps the greatest cause of the Civil War, her book. Talk about that later. All right, finally, this is not on the keynote that I provided, but this is a map in your book. And I think it is important to know, when did the northern states end slavery? And so most of the northern states, New York, Pennsylvania, and so on, were in the 1700s before the year 1800. Only New Jersey waited to 1804. But I think an important point is, before the Civil War, most of the northern states ended slavery basically 60 years before the Civil War. So no slavery becomes a part of their life in the North. All right, we get to talk about that guy. He is special. No beard, though, but his name is William Lloyd Garrison, a must-known A-push. And he is probably the most famous abolitionist besides Frederick Douglass. 30 years he fought against slavery and tried to end it immediately, from the years 1831 to the end of the Civil War. 1831, ironically, was also the same year as Nat Turner Rebellion. So he publishes a pamphlet called The Liberator. William Lloyd Garrison does highlight this in 1831. It's a newsletter condemning slavery, how bad it is, how wrong it is, and how we need to end it immediately in America. And actually, he got a little bit more radical as he aged. And so he started to make some interesting quotes. And so here's one of my most famous quotes in American history. William Lloyd Garrison, hope you feel it. Here we go. I will be as harsh as truth, and as uncompromising as justice. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. Oh my goodness, I'm a little lightheaded. Okay, so you definitely need to know William Lloyd Garrison, maybe the most radical of the abolitionists, but there's more. But you've seen these two names before, most likely Sojourner Truth. Okay, this is her image of her down here. She was a freed black woman who fought against slavery and for women's rights. She's one of the most famous Americans. And also another famous one is Frederick Douglass. Just wonderful person, interesting life. He was an ex-slave, and he was probably the greatest black abolitionist. Tremendous speaker, intelligent. He did become political, so he did want to use politics to end the problems and the suffering of slaves, and he was able to help make change. He also wrote an autobiography of his own life in 1845, and this is 15 years before the actual Civil War. And so these two are must-know abolitionists, and they're both African American. Okay, abolitionists also started to get political, and they started to form some parties. The first one was the Liberty Party, 1840. Not necessarily need to know that one, but the more important one you must know is the Free Soil Party, 1848. And this is the stance of the Free Soil Party is they were against the expansion of slavery. So they're against slavery in the Western territories, and this has become a big party later in APUSH. The South lashes back, and they are lashing back at the abolitionists. Okay, they were not fond of abolition because they wanted to end their slave system, and slavery was so important for their economy. So, the voice of white Southern abolition, and there may have been a voice, there might be some Southerners against slavery, but that was silenced after year 1830. So, what three events that happened during this time period would silence Southern abolitionists? Wait time. Number one, William Lloyd Garrison irritated the South, and he came out with the Liberator, very anti-slavery pamphlet newspaper. So that's one thing that irritated the South. Number two was the nullification crisis. South Carolina, 1832. The South was upset with the federal government handling that. They saw the federal government was becoming too powerful. Eventually, they may try to enforce the abolition of slavery. Third thing, the biggest thing, 1831, the Nat Turner Rebellion. After Nat Turner, no Southerner could support abolition because of what happened in Virginia. So again, I think 1831 is a critical year. In the early 1830s, abolition increases in the North. The South holds on to slavery even more. They do not want to let this go. Example is there are harsher slave codes against the slaves, or it's enforced even more. Just a quick review. What was the first ever slave code in the New World? 1600s. It was in the West Indies. I'll put it on my page. Southerners also defended slavery. So this is, can you do this? Can you defend slavery? Well, some Southerners did because they said that by owning their slaves, they taught them religion about God and supporting the Bible. They said, the Southerners, that the slaves became civilized because of them, and they said that they treated the slaves well. They had a paternalistic side of slavery, like a fatherly figure, like telling their children what to do. Also, the Southerners compared the slaves to the Northern factory workers, and they said that the Southern slaves were actually happier than the workers in the Northern factories, such as the mill girls or the immigrants. Okay, continuing this theme, the Southerners also argued that the Northern free blacks were persecuted and harassed even more than the Southerners. Okay, I would highlight this, the Gag Resolution, 1836. This is in Congress. The Southern House of Representatives, or the Southerners in the House of Representatives, passed this Gag Resolution, and it said that all anti-slavery appeals, so all abolitionist laws or any abolitionist talk, was to be tabled without debate. So basically, in 1836, the House of Representatives was not going to discuss slavery. This was eventually repealed in 1844. Which special person helped end the Gag Resolution? Some of you love him. I love him. Wait, it's not Lincoln? Oh, I thought it was Lincoln. It's actually John Quincy Adams, so I retract that. I didn't love John Quincy Adams, but he was an abolitionist, so I like that. So John Quincy Adams actually does end the Gag Resolution, not Lincoln. Man, when do we get to Lincoln, Beamer? Come on, it's Lincoln. I love him. All right, I guess I should get back to the video. All right, so the state of Georgia hated Garrison. I would think that, again, who did the South hate the most? Well, I got to think that Garrison was probably number one. They actually offered $5,000, Georgia did, for the arrest of William Lloyd Garrison because of his anti-slavery comments. All right, Southerners also resented from the North the flood of propaganda in the form of pamphlets, drawings, and so on. Southerners did not like the Northerners telling them what to do with their slaves. So the federal government actually banned abolitionist propaganda in the South beginning in the 1830s. So abolitionists could not even go to the South and try to spread anti-slavery feeling. The biggest reason why the South did this is they did not want another slave rebellion to happen like Nat Turner's. All right, the abolitionists' impact in the North. For a long time, abolitionists like the extreme, I would highlight the extreme, Garrisonians, people like William Lloyd Garrison, were very unpopular, even in the North. Garrison called for the secession of the North from the South. Probably a little drastic, but he said we're going to secede from the South because he hated slavery so much. Who would not like this from the North? Well, probably the Northern manufacturers did not want secession because they needed the Southern. What does the South produce? I forgot. All right, even attacks in the North did happen against the abolitionists. So Garrison was not loved by all, even in the North. Some people did not love him. He actually escaped a mob in Boston in 1835. Okay, if you get a chance, read about the last section, page 376. Read about what happened to him, like how he almost died. So in Boston, in the North, there are abolitionists, but some people did not like Garrison because he was so radical. Reverend Elijah Lovejoy, okay, this abolitionist was actually killed by a mob in Illinois, and he's considered the martyr abolitionist. Again, he stood up for his dislike of slavery, but he was killed by a mob in Illinois in 1837. So even in the North, some people were not abolitionists. Okay, some banks and people that loaned out money were not big into the abolitionist cause because if the abolitionists continued to complain, the South might break away from the North. And if the South breaks away, these banks may not get their money back that they loaned to the South. Okay, and so these people were not too supportive of the abolitionist cause as well because they might lose a bunch of money. Okay, a lot of names to know. In APUSH, there are some abolitionists you need to know. All right, Theodore Wilde, he was the one that gave the long, 18-day debate on slavery, and he was expelled from that. Elijah Lovejoy was the martyr abolitionist in Illinois. This guy was killed during a mob because of his anti-slavery views. Sojourner Truth, probably the most famous African-American woman abolitionist, and she also fought for women's rights besides the emancipation of slavery. We mentioned Harriet Beecher Stowe, wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, maybe the biggest cause of the Civil War. Talk about her later. Must know him and him. Okay, William Lloyd Garrison, the most radical of all the abolitionists wanted slavery now. Talk about potential secession. The North going to leave the South. So he was out there, and he also wrote The Liberator. I would know that. So he was probably the most famous abolitionist, him and that beautiful man right there. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, ex-slave, came up to the North and used politics to try to end slavery in the South. Finishing up the last section, the impact in the North of the abolitionists. So gradually, most Southerners thought everyone in the North was an abolitionist, and that was not true. We mentioned that in the previous slide, but that was their viewpoint. That was their perception of the North. Gradually, most Northerners, on the flip side, thought everyone in the South owned a slave, and we know that's not true as well. Only a quarter of all Southerners owned slaves. So the perception does become reality, and so this Northerners and Southerners see this as a serious roadblock for the future of our nation. And so, by the mid-1850s, many Northerners were beginning to support abolition, at least abolition in the Western territories. Okay, the new territories, Kansas, Nebraska, we'll get to this in later chapters. But many Northerners were starting to support abolition. And many of these Northern abolitionists decided to form the Republican Party, the party of today, the party of most of West Michigan, the party of Lincoln, and the party of the Prince of Darkness, Richard Milhous Nixon. Can I get an amen? Yeah, Nixon, yeah.